Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today I'm going over the news for the state of Georgia that outspoken Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene is reportedly considering a run for the U.S. Senate in the state of Georgia next fall, as long as she does not have to face off against Republican Governor Brian Kemp, according to a report published last Thursday by the Daily Caller. Citing two unnamed sources familiar with her thinking, the right-wing outlet reported that Marjorie Taylor Greene is evaluating a potential campaign for the seat currently held by Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff. The sources indicated that Greene's decision might hinge on whether Brian Kemp, who is wrapping up his second term as governor, chooses to enter the race. One source stated that Greene believes she would crush the Republican primary field if Kemp declines to run against Ossoff. Ossoff, who had won his seat in January 2021 runoff against former U.S. Senator David Perdue, is up for re-election and was expected to be one of the most competitive Senate races in the country. Georgia is the only state with a Democratic senator up for re-election in 2026 that President Trump also carried in 2024. Trump narrowly lost the state in 2020, the same year that both Perdue and former GOP Senator Kelly Loeffler lost their Georgia Senate races. The president had it out with Kemp publicly more than once after the election, but the two have since mended fences. Kemp is viewed by Republican strategists as the party's strongest challenger to Ossoff. According to polling cited by the Daily Caller, Kemp would be favored against Ossoff in a hypothetical matchup between the two. One of the Daily Caller's sources said the GOP primary field would be frozen until Kemp makes a decision, which he's expected to do by Memorial Day. In February, Greene told the Atlantic Journal-Constitution that she was not ruling out a run for governor of Georgia or challenging Ossoff. The congresswoman, who was first elected in 2020, reportedly believes her national profile and her relationship with Trump could boost her if she chooses to run for Senate. Okay, so this news is absolutely fascinating. And as the article mentioned, this does not specifically say Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to run for Senate in 2026. But it does open the possibility for her running for Senate in 2026 if the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, does not run. So the 2026 Georgia Senate race is Democratic incumbent Senator Jon Ossoff. He was elected back in 2021 in that runoff election. As mentioned, he's going up against a potential of possible Republicans in 2026. When Ossoff first got elected, it was back in 2020 on the same ballot when Joe Biden won the presidential election against Donald Trump by only 0.24%. What's interesting was back in 2020, in the initial round of voting, David Perdue actually defeated Jon Ossoff in the first round of voting for the Senate race. David Perdue got about 49.7%, and I believe Jon Ossoff got around 50% or so, or 49% or so. But Georgia has a rule in the Senate ratings where if the candidate does not break 50% of the vote, they go to a runoff election of the top two candidates without the third-party candidates. So then, after all the votes are counting, the winning candidate has to break 50% of the vote. And that's what happened. Both Ossoff's Senate race with David Perdue and Raphael Warnock's Senate race with Kelly Loeffler went to a runoff election, and David Perdue ended up losing to Jon Ossoff by 1.2%. in a very, very close race. As it sees here, the first round of voting, it was actually even lower than I remember. David Perdue got 49.73%, Ossoff got 47.95%. So, technically, you could say on the initial election, Perdue did beat Ossoff, but by the rules of Georgia's elections, Perdue did not do enough to win the race, which then opened the door for the runoff where Jon Ossoff was able to get a lot of Democratic voters out to vote for him and was able to defeat David Perdue. It's also worth noting that it seems based off the numbers going from November to the January runoff, Jon Ossoff only lost about 100,000 votes from November to January, whereas David Perdue lost about 250,000 votes. So that makes sense a little bit on the numbers why Ossoff was able to win. So as for 2026, obviously this race is going to be very close. Right now, Jon Ossoff has raised almost $32 million. He spent about $25 million with $11 million cash on hand. It's going to be one of the closest and most expensive Senate races in the history of the United States. Lots of Republicans have expressed interest in running for this race against Jon Ossoff. But chief among them, Governor of Georgia Brian Kemp, is widely viewed as the strongest Republican candidate. When you talk about candidate quality, the people who have the best chances of winning, Brian Kemp has now run for governor both in 2018 and 2020. He won a very close election in 2018 by 1.4% against Stacey Abrams, and then in 2022, he won re-election again facing off against Stacey Abrams, this time by 7.5%. And this is after the 2020 election when Donald Trump went after Brian Kemp multiple times and made numerous statements about Kemp that was trying to hurt Brian Kemp's chances in the primary. Donald Trump also tried to have Brian Kemp primaried in 2022 against former Republican Senator David Perdue. Kemp was able to win that primary in a blowout and go on to defeat Abrams by 7.5%. So Kemp is the strongest Republican candidate in the state of Georgia at winning statewide. And that's why Republicans want Kemp to run for the Senate race so much, because they believe that Kemp gives them the best chance at defeating Jon Ossoff, which even if Kemp is the nominee, it's not a 100% guarantee that Kemp will win. But Kemp by far gives the Republicans the best chance of winning. That's why Tim Scott, the U.S. Senator who's also in charge of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, which is the branch of the Senate for the Republicans in charge of trying to get more Republicans elected to the U.S. Senate, said that Brian Kemp is his number one recruit for the 2026 Senate cycle. Brian Kemp is the one Republican Tim Scott wants to run for U.S. Senate in the state of Georgia to try and win this race back. However, Kemp has been very non-committal on if he's going to run for Senate in 2026 or if he's not going to run. The speculation has been if Kemp does not run for Senate in 2026, maybe he would rather look at running for president in 2028 and try his chances with that. The question will be, though, if Kemp does not run for 2026 for the Senate race, who will? Lots of Republican representatives have expressed interest. Buddy Carter, Mike Collins, Tyler Harper, John King, and Rich McCormick all have expressed interest. Marjorie Taylor Greene, I would argue, is the largest, most well-known name out of all the potential candidates that could run for Senate in 2026 outside of Brian Kemp. The question will be, if this were to happen, what would the election actually look like? Well, let's make things very clear here. Marjorie Taylor Greene, statewide, I think would not even come close to doing as well as Brian Kemp. To me, that seems very obvious. And the only polling that's actually before that, the predictions so far, Inside Elections, Cook Political Report, Sabla Crystal Ball, all have this race listed as either a battleground or a toss-up. Race, though, White House does have it as still Democrat. Jon Ossoff versus a generic Republican from a poll by Signal back in March. It is a Republican-aligned pollster, had Ossoff and a generic Republican tied. But Jon Ossoff versus Brian Kemp in the 3 Republican polls taken so far, Kemp has led in every single poll. It is worth noting, in the most recent poll from February, it had it within the margin of error of 3.5%, essentially meaning it's a tied race. But in the 2 polls from back in January, Kemp was leading over Ossoff outside of the margin of error. Every other Republican candidate Ossoff has faced off against in the early polling, including Marjorie Taylor Greene, Ossoff has won, and it hasn't been that close. For Ossoff and Marjorie Taylor Greene, Ossoff already starts out over 50% at 51%. Taylor Greene is at 39%. Ossoff is the only matchup against Marjorie Taylor Greene where he's over 50% of the vote. So not only does Brian Kemp present the Republicans the best option based on early polling, it also shows Marjorie Taylor Greene would probably be one of the worst Republicans could run in 2026 in the Georgia Senate race, based on the fact that it would energize Democratic voters more than almost any other candidate. And I believe Marjorie Taylor Greene made a statement saying that she would get a lot of voters who are very loyal to President Trump out to vote for her in a way a lot of other Republican candidates can't. And to a degree, I would say that is very true. Donald Trump was able to win the state of Georgia by 2.2% in 2024, and usually a problem Republicans have is that when Donald Trump is not at the top of the ticket, like we saw in 2022, Republicans have fell short of getting a lot of voters who voted for Donald Trump in 2020 and 2024 and 2016 out to vote for Republicans in the midterm elections. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a very popular name in the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, and she would likely get a lot of the very Trump-loyal voters out to vote for her. The problem is she is not very well liked among non-Trump Republicans, moderates, independents, and certainly not among Democrats, which, when all of them combined together, would probably outnumber the MAGA Republicans in the state of Georgia, and probably by a significant amount. In 2022, we saw a scandal-plagued Republican in Herschel Walker go up against Raphael Warnock, the Democrat, in a race that looked like it could go Republican early on, and then Warnock ended up winning by 2.8%, in the Republican expected good night for the Republicans midterm election in 2022. Obviously, Democrats ended up doing much better, especially after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and it wasn't the big Republican night that many Republicans had hoped for. But still, Warnock was able to win re-election by 2.8%. If it's Marjorie Taylor Greene in 2026, things may be even worse for the Republicans than they were in 2022, because 2026 is expected to be a very good night for the Democrats this time around, where the Democrats have the momentum and the anti-Trump sentiment is likely going to be very high. So as for the Senate race in 2026, Georgia is one of the 4 Senate races right now I have as a battleground race capable of going to either the Democrats or Republicans. And my prediction for Kemp versus Ossoff has remained pretty consistent. If it's Kemp versus Ossoff, I think Brian Kemp wins, and I think he wins in a lean Republican margin around 1.5% to 2%. I think maybe at the max. I think Jon Ossoff, he is vulnerable, but he's in a very strong position as the incumbent U.S. Senator in Georgia. He's going to put up a very tough fight in 2026, and I think he's very capable of winning that Senate race in 2026. But Brian Kemp is such a strong candidate in the state of Georgia, the outgoing governor. He's very popular in the state, that I think Kemp's popularity would just be enough to be able to win a very close race. Now let's go down a different scenario where Marjorie Taylor Greene does run for Senate and it ends up being Jon Ossoff versus Marjorie Taylor Greene. In this scenario, I think MAGA voter turnout will be very high. A lot of voters very loyal to President Trump will come out and vote for her in 2026, but a lot of moderates and independents will come out and vote as well against Marjorie Taylor Greene for Jon Ossoff. I wouldn't be shocked if third-party vote would be a little bit higher than usual as well. In that matchup for Ossoff versus Greene, I think Ossoff starts out as the winner, and I have him winning by over 5 points. I think there are very few Republican candidates that have Georgia being more than a 5-point win for Ossoff in 2026, but I do think Marjorie Taylor Greene would be one of those candidates. But I'm interested to hear what you have to say. Make sure to leave a comment below telling me your thoughts about this potential news. Does a Marjorie Taylor Greene candidacy excite you or worry you in 2026? Maybe if you're a Republican or a Democrat in the state of Georgia, make sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. Again, remember to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next video.